Imsa visited the Indianapolis Motor Speedway for the second straight year and the first time for a 6-hour endurance race. In this race, we saw just about everything. From rain, to a huge championship-altering penalty, to more rain, and a breakout race for one manufacturer. Oh, and did I mention it was pretty wet? Now, coming out of this year's Battle on the Bricks, there are a ton of championship implications that went down not only during this race, but have emerged post-race as well. Before I get into all of those though, I want to talk about the race itself. And with this year's TireRack.com Battle on the Bricks being a 6-hour race as opposed to last year's 2-hour and 40-minute race, I think we can all let out a big collective sigh of relief knowing that this year's race was twice as long as last year's race, especially after how the first 3 hours of this race unfolded. You see, the first half of this race is one might call carnage-filled. The race started off damp, but it quickly transitioned to full wet conditions, and as soon as that happened, chaos began to ensue. As a matter of fact, there were so many incidents in the first half of this race that of the first 3 hours and 18 minutes of the race, just over half of it was spent under full course yellow. It's kind of a lot. However, to be fair, conditions were far from ideal. And while I don't really want to open up the conversation right now of what should be done in these long periods of heavy rain, whether the cars should be out there running around or whether you should slap the rain tires on them and let drivers, put their skill to the ultimate test in those situations, I don't want to open up that conversation right now, but I do think, all things considered, that this section of the race was handled properly. It was raining very heavily, and even though it did cost us a large chunk of the opening sort of half of this race, I think considering how much standing water was on the track, it probably would have been dangerous for them to continue. So I'm kind of fine with safety being put to the forefront and ultimately saving a bunch of machinery from being tore up. So yeah, I'm not going to touch a ton on the first half of the race because honestly, I really think that the second half of the race was where this race really came alive, and we saw some great battles develop in the second half. As the rain started to die down, the track conditions would improve. And it was really enjoyable to watch the teams and the drivers work on this tricky transition from that wet, damp track to a more dry track like they had been practicing on all weekend. In GTP, this is where we saw one of the best stories, I think, of the weekend unfold, and that was with the number 63 Lamborghini. During this tricky transition period, Romain Grosjean, who was behind the wheel, really got an opportunity to show off his talents. He charged through the field and made relatively large gaps between cars look very small as he would close them down and complete a pass quickly within just a couple of laps. And these passes, though, he was making were no freebies either. We're talking cars like the 01 Cadillac, who was quick all weekend, the 25 BMW, and ultimately, at the time, the race-leading number 6 Porsche. So yeah, the Lamborghini SC63 actually got to lead its first laps in Imsa competition in the Battle of the Bricks, and they had to do so by passing cars on track. This was not a strategy decision. This was just pure speed by Grosjean behind the wheel and that SC63. Now, of course, Grosjean did make a little bit of contact with the 6 while making that pass, but I don't want that to overshadow this stellar drive from him. Unfortunately, the SC63 would not remain at the front for too long. They ended up picking up a penalty on pit road and ultimately some damaged suspension due to contact, which would end their race early. But I think if you're Lamborghini coming out of this weekend knowing that you actually showed some strong pace, were able to lead some laps, I think that's a big win for them to carry into Petit Le Mans. Now, from a good surprise to maybe a not so good surprise, we move on to Porsche, and arguably the manufacturer who I think we all thought were the odds-on favorites to win heading into Indy. After all, they've been fantastic all season long, and they were really strong here last year. And while they did display good solid pace all weekend, and they were in the hunt for this race win kind of throughout the going, it wasn't their race pace or anything like that was the main talking point coming out of the weekend. It was a disastrous day for the championship leading number 7 Porsche. After starting 7th in an incredible opening laps to charge to the front and actually lead, that car would eventually kind of fall back to the middle of the GTP pack. They would hover around the sort of middle of GTP until late in the race. With just an hour and 14 minutes to go, the number 7 came to a stop on the front straightaway with power steering issues. This would of course drop them out of contention for a really solid race finish here, as they tried to nurse that power steeringless car home, and they actually brought it home in 7th when it was all said and done. Now thankfully for Porsche, even despite this bad day for the championship leading number 7, their closest non-Porsche competitor, the 01 Cadillac, would also have issues, as just before this power steering issue really took hold of that number 7, the 01 Cadillac was limping around the track after picking up a puncture a couple of laps after completing a pit stop. It was a real gut punch for the 01, especially considering just a short while after they had that puncture that the team that they were chasing in the championship had their big power steering issue. This issue for the 7 was not the only issue that Porsche would experience on the weekend. You see, after Sunday's race, Imsa went and impounded at least one of each of the manufacturer's cars for a more detailed and thorough post-race inspection. Now, this more thorough inspection, it doesn't happen after every single race, but is random. And unfortunately, the number 6 Porsche, who initially crossed the line in 3rd, was found to have modifications to its wiring harness that were outside of its homologation. This results in them being demoted to the back of the GTP class, where they ultimately would finish in 10th, and knocks them to 124 points behind their sister number 7 Porsche in the GTP championship fight. Now, they weren't the only ones that got busted here. The number 40 Wayne Taylor Racing with Andretti Acura also had some brake duct modifications that were found, and they were also moved to the back of the grid, so they finished 11th in the GTP standings. But overall, not great for Porsche, not great for the number 6, and ultimately we as fans are probably going to be losing out on a better championship fight for that GTP championship crown when we head to Petit Le Mans next month. Now, GTP wasn't the only class that saw big championship implications unfold in this race. LMP2 had some as well, albeit nobody was penalized post-race to affect things here. But without a doubt, the main story of this race, in my opinion, coming out of LMP2 was the championship fight. Heading into the race, the top 4 in the championship standings were separated by just 97 points. Emerging from the race, nobody is within 97 points of the leader now. After the 52 had another really solid day, leading 61 laps en route to another podium finish. And while they had yet another solid day, their championship rivals struggled a bit. The number 74, which came into this race second in the championship, would come home in 5th. The 18 Era Motorsports entry, who was 3rd in the championship hunt, would charge back from a spin in the wet early stages of the race, and also sustain a late race incident responsibility penalty to still finish on the podium. While the number 2, who also came into this race firmly in the championship hunt, went behind the wall with a little over an hour to go in the race, and would end up finishing 9th in the 10-car LMP2 field. Looking over at GTD Pro, and man, they always seem to put on a good race. And the championship hunt was looking good coming into Indy as well. And as the weekend would turn out, it wasn't such a smooth one for the championship leaders. After looking fairly strong in practice, the number 77 AO Racing entry went and set the fastest GTD Pro time in qualifying. Things were indeed, at the time, looking quite good for the championship leaders. However, in post-qualifying inspection, they were found to not meet the minimum ride height, and therefore vacated their pole position and not only had to go to the back of the GTD Pro class, but to the back of the entire GTD cars, so they were starting quite a ways back in this one. However, they showed strong speed all weekend, and that strong pace would certainly carry over to the race on Sunday. Over the course of the race, they slowly made their way through the field, and after the lengthy full course yellow for rain, they found themselves 6th in class. The second half of this race would see Rexy stay towards the front of the GTD Pro field. But the real crucial moment for them came on the final pit stop of the race under full course yellow. Here, Rexy would enter the pits in 3rd place, but they would come out in 1st after a fantastic stop that saw them leapfrog both the 64 and the number 14 entries. This would also start to set up this dramatic final stint in the GTD Pro field. Here we saw a great battle unfold for a couple of the podium positions, as the number 64 Ford Mustang, the number 14 Vassar Sullivan Lexus, the number 23 Heart of Racing Aston Martin, and the number 3 Pratt Miller by Corvette Racing Corvette went toe-to-toe in the final hour of this race. As they were battling around the traffic, the number 64 was able to squeak out to a slight gap over the cars that were battling for the last podium spot. Of course, there were huge championship implications that would come from this, and we'll get to those in just a moment. Before we do that though, there is GTD still to touch on. And per usual, the GTD class certainly had some hold your breath moments, especially when there was a trio of Ferraris going 3 wide in a battle that was quite fun to watch. And of course, maybe there was an accident or two that kind of left yourself scratching your head a little bit. But for the most part, the GTDs had a fairly quiet race. Now, while one car went on to largely steal the show and dominate the day, there were a couple of championship contenders that really caught my eye in this race. You see, at the halfway mark of this race, the number 57 Windward Racing Mercedes and the number 96 Turner Motorsports BMW were running 15th and 16th in the GTD class, and just really not showing that great pace that they had displayed throughout the season. The second half of this race, though, would be a completely different story. Once the track started to dry up, these cars both really came alive, and the 57 Mercedes, they would kind of slowly and methodically make their way up through the field, while the 96, on the other hand, was very much on a mission, and they found themselves up in second place for a majority of the final couple of hours. In fact, in the last stint of this race, the number 96 was really one of the only cars to truly challenge the number 120 Wright Motorsports Porsche, who had dominated most of the day. Although, at the end of the day, the 96 didn't quite have enough to get the 120 in pace. At the end of the GTD race, though, it was a dominating one for the number 120 Wright Motorsports Porsche of Jan Halen, Elliott Skier, and Adam Adelson, who led 140 of 207 laps en route to the win. The number 96 Turner Motorsports BMW and the number 32 Korthoff Preston Motorsports Mercedes would go on to round out the podium. In GTD Pro, well, you recall that excellent pit stop that Rexy made under the final full course yellow. Well, that would turn out to be the difference maker, as AO Racing with Michael Christensen and Lauren Heinrich would take Rexy across the finish line for their third win of the season. The number 64 Multimatic Ford, who showed great pace and led 50 laps in the finals hours of the race, held on for a second place finish. And after a great battle in the closing laps, the number 3 Corvette Racing by Pratt Miller Motorsports Corvette would come home in third place. It was also a strong race for the number 11 TDS Racing entry of Hunter McElrea, Mikael Jensen, and Stephen Thomas, who led 97 of 215 laps en route to the victory. Very interesting moment happened here at the midpoint of the race when virtually every car in the LMP2 class picked up a penalty for an unauthorized class split. The number 11 car was among those penalized. I think there was only one car that wasn't penalized, but they were able to rebound from that and of course go on to victory. The championship leading number 52 entry would come home in second, with the number 18 Era Motorsports entry rounding out the podium. And in GTP, what an excellent weekend it was for BMW. Not too often that we've been able to say that, as BMW M Team RLL had a heck of a battle between the 24 and the 25 in the closing stint of this race. Ultimately, it was the number 24 BMW M Team RLL M Hybrid V8 of Philip Ang and Jesse Krohn who took the win. They squeaked out BMW's first win on the racetrack. Yes, they actually got to cross the finish line first, unlike their win at the Watkins Glen last year, which came from post-race penalty, as the number 24 BMW beat out the sister number 25 by just 1.6 seconds. Now, the number 6 Porsche Penske Motorsports 963 initially crossed the finish line in third, but after failing tech inspection, it promoted the number 85 JDC Miller Motorsports Porsche onto the podium. This is JDC's first GTP podium and just the second one for a privateer entry in Imsa so far. Now, after every race, I like to ask you whether you thought the race was a good one, and after the battle on the bricks, 96% of you thought it was a good race. Honestly, I think I would agree with you. I do think that this race was helped out a little bit by the changing weather conditions that we saw throughout this race that really spiced things up in the opening 3 hours of the race. And despite there being a number of incidents, avoidable incidents at that for me kind of brings the race down a little bit, I think the great racing that we saw in the final stint of this one is really what helped put this over the edge. We saw fantastic battles here throughout the race, in GTP, in GTD Pro especially. And man, some of the good clean racing that we saw right at the end of this race, it was a lot of fun to watch and it was really good to see. So I'm giving the battle on the bricks a big thumbs up. I'd also give a solid thumbs up to some of the support series races that we saw going this weekend. In Lamborghini Super Trofeo, we saw Bryson Morris and Loris Cabarrou take the race 1 win in the Pro class, while Ernie Francis Jr. and Gianno Torino took the race 2 win. In the Pro-Am classes, it was Keon Tandon and Hannah Grisham that took race 1 victory, while Luke Berkeley and Garrett Adams took the race 2 win. In the Am division, Glenn McGee and Anthony McIntosh swept both of those races, while in the LB Cup, Nick Grote won race 1 and Rodrigo Valles won race 2. Porsche Carrera Cup North America was also present, and there in the Pro class, we saw Loic Hartog sweep the weekend yet again, while in the Pro-Am class, Alan Metney swept both of the races there. And in the Masters class, Scott Blind and Richard Edge picked up those 2 wins. Then there was the Michelin Pilot Challenge. Here, the number 39 Carbon BMW of Jeff Westphal and Sean McAllister took the GS win, ahead of the number 57 Windward Racing Mercedes and the number 95 Turner Motorsports BMW. While in TCR, it was the number 98 Brian Herta Autosports Hyundai Elantra of Mason Filippi and Mark Wilkins who took the win, ahead of the number 33 Brian Herta Autosports Hyundai and the number 17 Unitronic JDC Miller Sports Audi. Alright, let's take a quick look at those championship standings now, presented by P1 Web Development. If you're looking for a custom website, then look no further than P1 Web Development. You can check them out by clicking the first link in the description or heading to p1webdevelopment.com. In GTP, it's the number 7 Porsche Penske Motorsports 963 with 2,650 points. That is a 124-point gap back to the number 6 Porsche Penske Motorsports 963. The 01 Cadillac is still technically alive, albeit 164 points back, and rounding out the top 5 is the number 31 and the number 40. In LMP2, it's the number 52 Enter Europol by PR1 Matheson Motorsports entry, who leads the way with 1,919 points. That's 98 points ahead of the number 74 Riley entry, and 123 points ahead of the number 18 Era Motorsports entry. In 4th, we'll find the number 11 of TDS Racing, and rounding out the top 5, the number 2 United Autosports entry. In GTD Pro, it's Rexy that continues to lead with 2,887 points. That's a 99-point advantage on the number 23 Heart of Racing Aston Martin. The number 1 Paul Miller Racing BMW is in 3rd, the number 14 Vassar Sullivan Lexus is in 4th, and rounding out the top 5 is the number 3 Corvette Racing by Pratt Miller Motorsports Corvette. And in GTD, it's the number 57 Windward Racing Mercedes that leads there with 3,006 points. That's 222 points ahead of the number 96 Turner Motorsports BMW. The number 32 Korthoff Preston Motorsports Mercedes is in 3rd. The number 78 Forte Racing by USRT Lamborghini is in 4th. And rounding out the top 5, the number 34 Conquest Racing Ferrari. With Indy in the books, we just have one lone round left on the 2024 Imsa season, and that comes at Petit Le Mans. However, it's never too early for a little bit of silly season news, and I got you covered with all the silly season news you need to know right here. Huge shout out to all the channel supporters. If you too want to support the show, then you can head to patreon.com/offtheS's, click the join button below. Once again though, thanks for tuning in. I hope everyone has a great race weekend and doesn't go off in the S's.